Forbidden Fruit. Banned, censored, and challenged books from the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library and beyond by P.J. Carefoote, Head of the Department of Rare Books and Special Collections, Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library at the University of Toronto. In one way or another, I've been interested in censorship since I was a little kid. Whether it was the comic books that the teacher confiscated in elementary school, or subjects I wasn't supposed to discuss when company was invited over for dinner, or the movies we were told we weren't supposed to go and see, every time I was told that something was off limits, I just wanted to know why. The prohibition itself was enough to make me want to know more about it, and that's why I've called this lecture today Forbidden Fruit. It's always the most delectable. So I've decided to focus today not so much on the morality of censorship, but on its ultimate futility by looking at its history. What you are looking at here is a beautiful woodcut from Ovid's Metamorphoses that was printed in Venice in 1517. The image depicts the adultery of Venus and Mars while Venus's husband Vulcan looks on. It's one of the earliest examples I can find from the University Library's collections of someone deliberately deciding for us what a good boy or a good girl should not see, but I doubt that they succeeded. This particular image comes from the collections of the Center for Reformation and Renaissance Studies, and it just makes me want to know even more what lies beneath those pen strokes. As we take a quick look at the past 500 years of print history, considering specific printed works and examining the reasons why people have tried to stop us from looking at them, I hope that we'll come to agree that their efforts were not only futile, but ultimately short-sighted. As I mentioned at the beginning, I have the honor of being the head of the Department of Rare Books and Special Collections at the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library at the University of Toronto. My very first day in that beautiful building that you are looking at here was, of all days, September the 11th, 2001. And when I emerged from that reflective space by noon hour, it was clear that our world outside had changed forever. My interest in censorship was renewed when it became apparent to me, in the aftermath of that terrible event, that even in our liberal society, the censorship of words was very much alive and well. Magazines and newspapers became increasingly anxious not to offend readers who were still reeling from the vicious attacks on our American neighbors. Authors, artists, radio and television personalities who tried to contextualize the terrible violence of that day, here you may think of Susan Sontag, Andy Rooney, and Bill Maher, who immediately come to mind. These people were roundly criticized for expressing a dissenting opinion, and then often silenced and generally forced to issue public retractions for what amounted to reasoned thought. One might fairly wonder what our world would be like today had the words of critics like Walter Cronkite been more broadly disseminated rather than restricted to a very few journals and newspapers like Harper's. I believe that history demonstrates that the censorship of words is futile because it does not and cannot eliminate the ideas behind them. I believe that the strength of our democratic society is ultimately found in the free flow of ideas, even bad ones, followed by their discussion and criticism. And so, using history as our guide and some of the books from the Fisher Rare Book Library, I will argue that the fact that we still have interesting and important books in our libraries and bookstores and homes is testimony to courage, because invariably, the presence of these books and journals on our shelves means that someone, often at great personal cost and sometimes with their lives, committed themselves to issuing, disseminating, and protecting this material for us to read, analyze, and enjoy today. The evolution of censorship provides us with an interesting reflection of the concerns and social taboos of any given place and time in history. In the 16th century, for example, censors aimed to control the discussion of God and how God operated in the universe. Here you can think of Martin Luther and John Calvin, who challenged the theological status quo of their day. In the 17th century, the censors narrowed their focus a little to deal with authors who wrote on the relationship between God and specifically this world from the new perspectives of science, which seemed at least to contradict the Bible. Here you can think, of course, of Copernicus and Galileo. In the 18th century, the focus narrowed yet again to those new philosophers like David Hume and Voltaire, who inquired into the ways in which humans related politically and socially to one another. And then, in the 19th century, the censors' attention narrowed even more to challenge realism in literature and evolutionary theory, authors like Victor Hugo and Charles Darwin. And in the 20th century, it was one specific aspect of the individual, the sexual, that consumed the majority of the censors' ink. Today, in the 21st century, it sometimes seems like everybody gets offended by everything. Now, one last technical comment. You will hear me use 3 terms, and it helps if you can keep them straight in your minds. Books can be banned, censored, and challenged. Banned means exactly what it says. The book is absolutely forbidden. Censored means that certain words or images are altered to allow the book into public circulation. And challenged refers to the effort to ban or censor a work already in print. But without further ado, let's take a look at how we got to where we are today in a world where the internet has really changed everything. Religion is, of course, a great place to start. Without doubt, the most effective censorship campaign in the West was undertaken by the Roman Catholic Church beginning in the 16th century and lasting until the 20th. For Catholicism, the new printing press, invented around the year 1450-1460, was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it helped the Church get its message out more effectively than anything else that had come before, but that same press also threatened its previously uncontested control of thought and belief. And so, to protect the Church's privileged position, in 1557, Pope Paul IV authorized the first index of forbidden books, and various editions were issued until the last one appeared in 1948. According to the Church's law, if an author's name appeared in its pages, then no one was allowed to read or possess the books without the special permission of Church authorities. And even when permission was obtained, it was granted only for individual books, in urgent cases, and for a specific duration. The index actually remained in force until 1966, and over the years included in it were such noteworthy books as Machiavelli's The Prince, Boccaccio's Decameron, Voltaire's Candide, Diderot's Encyclopedia, all of the writings of David Hume, Rousseau's Social Contract, all versions of the Quran, Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and Marx's Communist Manifesto, to name just a few. In the last edition, issued in 1948, there were 4,126 prohibited books, of which 255 came from the 20th century alone. Let's look a little more closely at Copernicus and Galileo. Copernicus, I'm sure you'll recall, was the first person who taught that the sun, not the earth, was the center of our universe, thus challenging a principle of both science and faith held for thousands of years. It was only in 1543, after Copernicus had died and when his ideas appeared in print, that the radical nature of his quote-unquote theory caught the censors' attention. In 1616, his book De Revolutionibus, which influenced Galileo, was placed on the index of forbidden books until its fundamental error of heliocentrism was corrected. Since Copernicus was dead, he couldn't make the necessary corrections himself, obviously. So in 1620, the Vatican told librarians what changes to make manually in their copies of his book. Surviving copies show that few owners actually made the adjustments, and the ones that did often did it by just putting a single thin line through the offending text, which in the end serves more like a highlighter than it does censorship. In 1633, Copernicus's theory was officially condemned by the Church, creating a breach between Catholicism and the scientific community that has been long in the mending. Now, against the Vatican censor's strenuous objections, Pope Pius VII finally lifted the ban against Copernicus and his writings in 1834. Galileo's dialogue of 1632, of course, confirmed Copernicus's discoveries, but his efforts actually earned him prison time in 1634 on the charge of heresy, and his book was formally condemned that same year. He was placed under house arrest for the rest of his life until his death in 1642. Galileo's name remained on the index of forbidden books until 1835, and he himself was not officially pardoned until Pope John Paul II did so in 1992. One last author will have to suffice for our brief examination of the influential Roman index of forbidden books, and that's Victor Hugo and his book Les Miserables, first published in 1862. His depiction of social unrest in France earned the book a place on the Roman index in 1864, since the Church was utterly terrified of the upheaval sweeping Europe that would ultimately result in the loss of its own papal states in 1870. In addition, Church censors were shifting their focus from theological and scientific issues to questions of personal morality. Their concern was with the new realistic style emerging in French fiction. Depictions of sexual impropriety, moral relativism, the serious plight of the poor, and a broad-based secular humanism seemed rampant in the writings of such authors as Balzac, the two Dumas, father and son, Georges Sand and Stendhal, and consequently they were all placed on the Roman index. A glance at the original illustrations from the 1862 edition of Les Miserables conveys something of the melodrama that so upset authorities, images that they feared would stir up the passions of the reading public. The Church was not the only institution that resisted French realism, however. Hugo's earlier works had been censored in France for their criticism of post-revolutionary society, and officials feared that the subtext of Les Miserables, with its emphasis on a new day dawning for the downtrodden classes, might be a source of renewed turmoil in the country. On the other side of the Atlantic, the book was removed from several libraries, including Philadelphia's in 1904, because of its depiction of the pathetic Eponine character as a bohemian type that became synonymous with prostitute in the early 20th century. As late as 1954, Carlos Castillo Armas burned Les Miserables after he seized control of the government of Guatemala, fearing that the book might inspire the poor in his own country to do something about their desperate poverty. Hugo was finally removed from the index in 1959. It should be noted that books of a sexual nature rarely ever appeared on the index, however. For example, Burton's Arabian Nights, D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, and Kinsey's famous study on sexual behavior in the human male were never included. Before we move on, a brief word about another form of censorship which the Church developed and which was eventually imitated by governments all over the world, and that is the Index Librorum Expurgatorum, or the Index of Expurgated Books. Its purpose was to help librarians in the partial censorship of works by otherwise acceptable authors by indicating the exact page numbers and sentences to be expunged from an offending text of a particular edition using a black ink pen. The ink which was used to obliterate these passages often had a high lead content and did a far more thorough job of eliminating text than even the censors could have imagined by sometimes eating right through the page. Here we have two examples of books that have been altered in keeping with the Roman censors' instructions. This first is Judah ben Samuel's Sefer HaHasidim, or the Book of the Pious, that had been printed in Bologna in the year 1537. Now, since the year 1144, when it was first burned in Paris on charges of blasphemy, this ancient collection of rabbinical wisdom has almost constantly attracted the attention of censors. Any reference to Jesus, the cross, and converts to Christianity were eliminated. I particularly like this example because you'll note that in the margins, another hand has actually rewritten the offending sections of the text, pointing once again to the futility of this sort of censorship. This second example is one of the most aesthetically beautiful instances of censorship that I have ever seen, and it comes from the Center for Reformation and Renaissance Studies at Victoria College, University of Toronto. What you're looking at here is a copy of Erasmus's 1538 commentary on the works of St. Ambrose. Here you can see that the librarian did comply with the censor's directives, but that the offending words have been obliterated in a way that respects the book. Certainly the librarian did not want to see it defaced. Instead, stylized Renaissance frames and an imaginative use of watercolors block the felonious texts. But in both of these cases, don't the censor's attempts only make the reader even more curious to discover what lies beneath? And here is one last not so beautiful attempt at censoring Erasmus, this time his adages of 1541. The librarian here has purposely defaced the copy. Any offensive text, however, is still ultimately visible if one tries hard enough. That may help to explain, therefore, why perhaps the same librarian took it to another level and actually started to glue the pages of this book together so that they could not be read. Of course, the banning and censoring of early print materials also adds to their rarity and their value. Here you are looking at two broadsides published by Martin Luther in the year 1545. They are part of his series entitled Images of the Papacy, and they are hardly flattering, and of course did attract the attention of censors. It is estimated, for example, that only 18 copies of the original series of 9 caricatures are still in existence in some form. The Fisher Library owns 7 that survived the centuries, hidden as paste downs in a Saxon bookbinding dating from 1569. Now, lest non-Catholics become too smug in the face of all this detail, the fact is that other denominations attempted to control print as well. The problem was that they didn't have the same universal presence as the Roman Catholic Church and so could not be as effective. We see here, for example, the University of Oxford itself and its list of forbidden books issued in 1683, including authors such as Thomas Hobbes and John Milton. Indeed, England had a very long history of literary censorship. Right now, you are looking at the title page to what I believe is one of the most important English books ever printed, the 1534 edition of the New Testament, translated by William Tyndale. As late as 1524, England was the only European country that did not allow the Bible to be printed in the vernacular. The reason for this prohibition was that the Crown and its ministers believed that the scriptures could not truly be understood by the lower classes without the interpretation of their betters. Tyndale, of course, believed otherwise and vowed that he would not rest until the plain word of God found its way into the hands of the plowboy. This was a radical opinion on many levels, not the least of which was advocating for the education of the plowboy. In addition, he translated words provocatively, such as using the word presbyter instead of priest and congregation instead of church. As a result, his New Testament was denounced and Tyndale was arrested in Antwerp while translating the Old Testament. Taken to Brussels, he was strangled and burned at the stake, an execution that took place with Henry's blessing after his split with the Church of Rome. This testament was slightly bigger than your wallet. Its diminutive size thumbs the nose at the censors, since it could be easily hidden in a sleeve or under a hat or in the straw of an ox cart, unlike the majority of larger Bibles printed before or since. Possession of it remained illegal in England throughout much of the 16th century, even after the Reformation, and could merit the death penalty for anyone found owning a copy of it. And although every copy of Tyndale's Bible found by the authorities was burnt, their efforts could not prevent the fact that it did survive in sufficient numbers so that about 9/10 of it lives on in what we know today as the King James Version of the Bible. It has had a direct effect on the development of our language unlike any other book. The adage goes, no Tyndale, no Shakespeare, and yet this was the book they would have had us not read. Other books that had been considered perfectly orthodox before Henry's separation from the Church of Rome came under suspicion after the Reformation. Here you are looking at two copies of one of the greatest works of medieval Christendom, the Golden Legend. On the right is the 1507 edition in English, and on the left, the 1527 edition. A reformer at some point has gone through and edited these books, the one on the left routinely removing the word Pope from the descriptions, replacing it with the word Bishop, and the name of Thomas of Canterbury, Thomas of Becket, being removed. On the right, we can see that both the image and the story of Thomas Becket have been censored. Interestingly, however, a later owner has gone back and washed the page, bleaching out the mark of censorship, so that the story of Thomas may be read once again. The attempt to control the publication of books, whether they were works of religion, philosophy, political science, or science, has been a common enough practice throughout the centuries from the Reformation until the present day, and happened in every jurisdiction, whether it was France, Spain, or the Holy Roman Empire. The most famous modern crusade against literature was, of course, the Nazis, who issued numerous indexes of forbidden books. It was their 1933 bonfires of any text deemed subversive or written by Jewish authors that have captured the popular imagination, of course. Here you are looking at a Nazi index that is found in the Fisher collections. This one is specifically directed at young people. They were concerned that books that were being issued by the publishing houses of the United States, especially ones that dealt with the American West, and murder mysteries cheaply produced in England, such as those of Agatha Christie, would contribute to the corruption of the morals of the youth. In this slide, we see a Czech geography textbook, which has been censored in compliance with Nazi instructions. In it, all references to the independence of Czech or any of the other countries now under the domination of the Nazis is systematically removed. This striking monument that you are now looking at recalls those tragic bonfires and is a recent addition to Berlin's Bibelplatz. It is an evocative subterranean room containing nothing but empty bookshelves seen through the floor of the square. The United States, of course, has not been exempt from literary censorship. During the McCarthy era of the 1950s, expressing opinions in print sympathetic to socialism brought ostracism, job loss, and arrest. This is not to say that printing presses have not helped propagate many corrupt and loathsome political philosophies. One need only look at the 20th century to confirm that they have. But it has too often been the case that the stronger members of society use censorship as a tool to keep weaker members in their place. And rather than discuss the flaws of a particular philosophy, they have chosen the path of least resistance, which is simply to ban or censor a publication. Now, lest we think that the banning, censoring, and challenging of books has been limited in the Western world to Europeans and Americans, this might be as good a time as any to review, however briefly, the Canadian record. Since well before 1867, the various parliaments of Canada have enacted laws aimed at controlling vice and combating sedition. Under this rubric, publications that, for example, supported responsible government in the years before the rebellions of 1837, or which encouraged workers to strike in the wake of the First World War, were routinely suppressed, their publishers charged, and their files or presses seized. For the most part, it was Canada Customs that was responsible for the control of literature, since our most popular books were generally published abroad until fairly recently. Until 1968, customs officials could refer to a list of forbidden publications when refusing to admit a book or journal into the country. No such guide exists any longer, so until very recently, officers operated according to their own personal discretion, to which bookstores like Little Sisters in Vancouver and Glad Day in Toronto can well attest. The fact is, however, that things have finally changed somewhat in Canada in the 21st century with regards to the banning and censoring of materials that are printed abroad. Now, it is far more difficult for the individual customs agents to act on their own initiative. In the year 2000, the Supreme Court of Canada did uphold the right of Canada Customs agents to continue to inspect and seize sexually obscene materials, but at the same time, it also criticized the agency for specifically focusing on materials with gay and lesbian themes, especially when imported by gay and lesbian booksellers. It also determined that customs agents could only confiscate materials that had been specifically ruled by the courts to constitute an offense under the Criminal Code of Canada. No longer could an agent operate solely on his or her own discretion. Canada Customs, however, has no control over materials that are printed inside the country. As a result, it is possible to produce a book in Canada legally that it would be otherwise illegal to import. Such was the case, for example, with this very rare copy of the Communist Manifesto, now in the Fisher's Kenny collection, which could not be legally imported after World War I, but could be legally printed here, and was, in Vancouver in 1919, through a bequest from George Whitehead, whose estate provided for the publication of a number of socialist pamphlets during the interwar years. It is left to the Criminal Code to determine what may or may not be printed in the country, which can often prove problematic since it depends on what are vaguely described as community standards, without defining which community or whose standards. For librarians, of course, this isn't just a theoretical issue. It's a matter of policy and informs how we choose to add controversial materials to our collections or not. In the last 100 years, obscenity has become the focus of Canadian censorship. In 1949, of the 126 titles excluded from Canada, only 29 were deemed seditious. The remainder were declared obscene. In 1954, the government formally defined obscenity in the Criminal Code to state that any publication, a dominant characteristic of which is the undue exploitation of sex, or of sex in any one or more of the following subjects, namely crime, horror, cruelty, and violence, shall be deemed to be obscene. This definition still stands more than 60 years later and is enforced by the current Criminal Code and is binding on publishers, printers, distributors, and libraries. The problem with Canadian law is not with the definition of obscenity so much as with its interpretation. Does the definition of obscenity remain valid forever? What constitutes undue exploitation? Should interpretation remain in the hands of individuals who may not have even read the offending item? Is there any objective way of determining whether a book, in and of itself, is an agent of corruption? It is interesting that while it is true that the actual banning of books became increasingly rare in the 20th century, there have never been so many challenges made to individual literary works in our history as there have been in the last 50 years. In 1949, Maclean's magazine published an article entitled "Our Hush Hush Censorship," and I think its conclusions remain essentially valid today. Quote, "No one is qualified to be a censor," the article states. For censorship is itself an outrage and a contradiction of freedom. The essence of free speech and a free press is that a man may say what he likes, print what he likes, and then stand responsible for it after it has been uttered." Close quote. Just to consider a few gems from Canada's censorship history. James Joyce published his masterpiece Ulysses in 1922. With its graphic biological descriptions, the book was banned in Canada the following year, a ban that was not lifted until 1949. It was actually banned in the United States a few months earlier than here, so the story is told that Ernest Hemingway, who still had friends in Toronto from his days as a reporter working at the Star, sailed out into the middle of Lake Ontario from the New York side, where he met up with some Canadian pirates who passed the contraband boxes of Ulysses from boat to boat as if they were a prohibited gin shipment, and that was how copies made their way into the United States. Even after the ban was lifted, readers at several public libraries, such as Vancouver's, still had to make formal applications to read it, and a record of their request was kept. When the unexpurgated edition of D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover appeared in Canada in 1960, it was immediately banned. Judge T.A. Fontaine of Montreal pronounced the work obscene and set aside the expert testimony of both Hugh MacLennan and Morley Callahan, declaring their interventions to be purely personal opinion, as though his opinion were not. The following year, Canada Customs even held up the importation of the news reports of the British trial of the book because of the explicit details they contained. In 1962, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that the work was not obscene and allowed its sale. 2 years later, however, the book was once again condemned in Ontario, but the case was narrowly dismissed by the Supreme Court of Canada in a 5-4 decision. Today, censorship has largely shifted ground to the classroom and the library, and as you may know from recent articles about freedom of expression on campus, universities are not above the fray. I'm not going to get into the details associated with individual examples, but 2 cases from the University of Toronto show what modern educators are often up against. The first is Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses, published in 1988. With the exception of the Harry Potter series, few works have gained this much attention for all the wrong reasons. Rushdie's novel, of course, earned him a death sentence under the late Ayatollah Khomeini. It was banned in South Africa, burned in Britain, and prohibited in most Muslim nations. Even magazines like Time and Newsweek, which published literary reviews of the work, were not allowed to circulate in many areas for fear of igniting public outrage. Ironically, during Freedom to Read Week in 1989, Canada earned the distinction of being the only Western democracy to seize the Satanic Verses after Revenue Canada received a complaint that it was hate literature. To this day, there is no copy of the first edition in the Robarts Library. Instead, that edition is housed in the Fisher Library for safekeeping. The fact is that it was continually stolen or damaged even while it was in the collection development offices, showing that sometimes a book ends up being restricted not to prevent access, but to enable it. In the early and mid-20th century, the University of Toronto regularly restricted access to books, not for their protection, however, but for the protection of the morals of their students. Morley Callahan's Such Is My Beloved, the story of a Toronto Catholic priest and his association with the city's prostitutes, was among the books consigned to what was then known as the art room cupboard that could be found in the chief librarian's office. In that cupboard, you would also be able to find Aristophanes' Lysistrata, works written by the Marquis de Sade, and by James Joyce. In addition, that was also where you found the more precious incunables and manuscripts that belonged to the university. To gain access to these more questionable volumes, students had to make a formal application, a record of which would be retained by library staff, of course, causing more than one undergraduate cause for pause. Every once in a while, we still have to deal with people asking for material from that long-gone cupboard who are using out-of-date call numbers from out-of-date bibliographies. The other interesting case of challenged literature at institutes of higher learning like the University of Toronto surprisingly involves maps. We tend to think of them as rather anodyne printed works, but depending on your perspective, they can be incendiary. Israelis and Arabs may view contemporary maps of the Near East with suspicion, and sometimes open hostility, depending on how the Palestinian territory appears or doesn't, and how it is labeled. The same goes for territory claimed by China and Korea and Japan and other points of geopolitical contention around the world. Students and faculty will complain about certain maps being added to our collections, and in some cases, they just take matters into their own hands. In this slide, for example, one student, presumably Korean, has renamed some islands known in English by the neutral title the Liancourt Rocks as Dokdo, eradicating the Japanese name Takashima, and thereby claiming Korean sovereignty over the territory, at least in print. The same hand has also crossed out the Sea of Japan, renaming it the East Sea. Things have certainly taken an interesting twist in the latter 20th and early 21st centuries. It's as though all of the taboos of the previous 5 centuries have rolled into one, and everyone has become so sensitive about everything that it seems almost impossible at times to write anything without offending someone. This form of censorship is often practiced by people on the political left, but it has the same detrimental effect as does the censorship advocated by the political right that we have been seeing to this point. It is really an attempt to deny historical reality in favor of an unhistorical idealism, and is particularly focused on school libraries and classroom curricula. So, for example, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice is challenged because of its realistic depiction of anti-Semitism. A Comedy of Errors has been challenged for its supposed misrepresentation of transvestitism. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written at the end of the 14th century, is another example. No one really has a problem with it when it looks like it did here in this 1542 edition from the Fisher Library, all neat and tidy in its romantic, Gothic, near unintelligible lettering. It looks a lot different, however, when you can actually read it with ease. It has been regularly challenged since the 1950s in both Britain and the United States because the Pilgrim's stories, though charmingly related in the vulgar tongue, have apparently proven to be too vulgar for many school boards. One of my recent favorites comes from 2014, when a challenge was issued against the Toronto Public Library, which was asked to ban Dr. Seuss's Hop on Pop because one gentleman felt it was just too violent. The unnamed complainant demanded that the book be removed from the library's collections and that TPL, quote, issue an apology to fathers in the GTA and pay for damages resulting from the book. Obviously, a challenge like this one is lacking in both subtlety and humor. A sense of subtlety, however, is needed to understand the recent controversy over whether to continue teaching To Kill a Mockingbird in our Toronto high schools. Critics of the Harper Lee masterpiece admit it is an excellent book. Indeed, in the fall of 2018, To Kill a Mockingbird was chosen by PBS viewers as America's favorite book. The objection, however, is that if you are going to use only one piece of literature to teach about a particular social issue, in this case, prejudice against the black population, is it not best to have the subjects of that issue, in this case a member of the black population, tell their own story rather than filter it through white eyes? To Kill a Mockingbird is neither being challenged nor banned, but set against the context of alternatives, first-hand narratives, such as Lawrence Hill's The Book of Negroes, that might do the job better. Ideally, To Kill a Mockingbird should be read in conjunction with these other titles. This is not at all the same as what has happened, for example, to classics like Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer and Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which have also fallen afoul of the parent councils, school boards, library boards, and censors in general in recent decades. Critics, in their cases, have argued that it is better to ban these texts altogether and thereby lose the lessons of history contained within them, rather than encourage readers, and students in particular, to have healthy and honest conversations about why the treatment of Jews throughout history has been so abysmal, why Islam is upset about its representation in Western literature and media, and why, as in these two cases, it is demeaning and dehumanizing to call someone the N-word. Making books disappear does not resolve the underlying prejudices that they record, and in fact may eliminate an opportunity for readers to confront stereotypes in a creative way. We should use literature to destroy the myths, rather than allow the myths to destroy the literature. In the end, nothing has changed with this type of liberal censorship except the motives. The result is the same, and as benevolent as their intentions may be, such censors still are trying to prevent others from reading what they themselves dislike. Of course, society will always have an obligation to protect those who are incapable of defending themselves. The right of free expression and a free press is not absolute, as is stated in Section 1 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It is incumbent on all of us to ensure that when civil discourse transforms into hate speech, or when the most vulnerable, like our children, are being exploited, we then allow the Canadian Criminal Code to do its job and intervene to stop or seize publications that violate its standards and thereby prevent further harm. No one has ever said, "I think this book or magazine should be banned because it will have a negative effect on me." They're always challenged by those who think that they know better than their neighbors and are supposedly protecting their best interests. At its core, censorship is paternalistic. It's based on the exercise of authority rather than on reasoned argument, and I believe, as I was taught in school, the argument from authority is always the weakest. It presumes either that I cannot handle controversial material myself, or that I cannot teach my children how to read it. And as I've tried to indicate, it's generally a futile exercise, and one that is becoming even more futile as the internet makes censorship almost impossible. Ironically, the internet could force us to have the conversations we should have been having years ago about what is appropriate for reading and viewing and what is not, when in the past we would simply have just issued a ban. Like it or not, in a democracy, writers and journalists have every right to offend, and we have every right to be offended. But as history shows, in a free society, it is that very push and pull which in the end strengthens us and pushes civilization forward, quite painfully at times. So what would our world look like today if the censors had actually succeeded, and the books I've mentioned and the countless others in our libraries and bookstores and newsagents had been destroyed or never existed at all? Your answer, I hope, would be the same as that of George Bernard Shaw, who said, "Censorship ends in logical completeness when nobody is allowed to read any books, except the books that nobody reads." Thank you.